Now available in paperback and Kindle, All About Marilyn. Learn all about the struggles of a faded former teen sitcom star in this absolutely fabulous 5-star screenplay. Get All About Marilyn in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com today. Hollywood Historical Couples in Crisis. One of my viewers wanted me to do a special installment of the Hollywood Historical series. And for this special installment of the Hollywood Historical series, I'm going to be delving into some historical couples in crisis, starting with Academy Award-winning actress Elizabeth Taylor and 3 of her husbands, Conrad Hilton Jr., Eddie Fisher, and Richard Burton. Now, the first celebrity I'm going to be talking about in this Couples in Crisis video is actress Elizabeth Taylor. Now, actress Elizabeth Taylor, known as Dame Elizabeth Taylor now because she has been given that title by the late Queen, is one of the greatest actresses of the 20th century and is considered an icon of 20th century Hollywood. Now, Elizabeth Taylor went on to have one of the greatest careers in Hollywood and has starred in many iconic roles such as National Velvet, such as Father of the Bride, such as Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, such as Butterfield 8, and films like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and has gone on to win Golden Globes and 2 Academy Awards, and is considered again to be one of the great icons of 20th century Hollywood. And in spite of all of that great success that Elizabeth Taylor enjoyed as an actress and an entertainer, Elizabeth Taylor never really had much success in her personal life, and it was many of the issues as related to her personal life that actually put her on the road to becoming a woman in crisis. Now, Elizabeth Taylor's story of success is considered legendary, but she is considered to be a great tragedy as related to her personal life, because at a young age she was basically put on the road to feminism by her mother, and being put on that road to feminism at a young age basically put her on the road to becoming a woman in crisis. Now, Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was born in 1932 in England, and she had dual British-American citizenship because her father, an art tailor, Francis Len Taylor, and her mother, it was actress Sarah Southern, and they basically wound up moving to London back in the 1920s, then had their kids, and then before World War II started, they moved to the United States with the help of U.S. Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. And after they moved to the United States, Elizabeth Taylor's mother was told by people that her daughter should audition for films because of Elizabeth Taylor's distinct blue eyes, which are so dark that they appear to be violet, and the double eyelashes that she has caused by a genetic mutation. Now, her mother didn't really want her to appear in films, but decided to do so because she wanted to assimilate into American society. And as Elizabeth Taylor was starting to do auditions and starting to look to work in films, this is basically what put Elizabeth Taylor on the road to being a woman in crisis, because as Elizabeth Taylor was going out here getting roles, what happened was her father, who was an art dealer, was starting to become resentful because he wanted to be the man and the head of household, and because he wanted to be the man and the head of household and have all the power, what happened was he started to become extremely insecure and felt emasculated when his daughter was out here making more money than he was, and because he felt emasculated and felt powerless as a man regarding the fact that his daughter was making more money than he was, what happened was Elizabeth Taylor's father began to abuse Elizabeth Taylor. Now, as he abused Elizabeth Taylor for having all of this fiscal and economic success as related to her acting, this basically created a series of complexes that created a life paradigm for Elizabeth Taylor where she could never achieve any of the personal success in any relationship. Now, Elizabeth Taylor said when she was out here, she was looking to marry for love. Unfortunately, she was never able to find love because of the model of manhood that her father showed her by being an alcoholic and abusive man. Because when it comes to girls, the first man in their life is their father, and the father's model for manhood is the one that the daughter follows when she's out here looking for a future husband. And with Elizabeth Taylor, because she suffered so much abuse at the hands of her father, this basically put Elizabeth Taylor on a road to a paradigm of failure, similar to what I talk about in my book, Why 70% of Black Women Are Single. And what happened with Elizabeth Taylor was because she was out here having all of this economic success and making more money than her father. What this did was make it where he felt like he wanted to abuse her because he was feeling insecure and inadequate about himself. And this made it where Elizabeth Taylor was stuck in a power struggle with the issues as related to her father, whereas she wanted to go out here and find a man to love her. Unfortunately, subconsciously, what was happening was she wanted to be able to be the one who had power in the relationship. And because she wanted to be the one who had power in the relationship, this made it where she didn't want to submit to a man because she didn't trust any man, because she feared if she trusted that man, he would go out here and abuse her. Unfortunately, because of the issue she was having, what was happening was, instead of her attracting a man of character who could love her for who she was, what happened to Elizabeth Taylor was she was attracting the same type of toxic man that was similar to her father. Now, what further compounded this abuse was the fact that the studio executives like Louis B. Mayer and others were out here and had no respect for Elizabeth Taylor and basically saw her as a piece of property they could go out here and use. So instead of Elizabeth Taylor growing up in a functional environment and around functional people, she grew up around dysfunction. And as she grew up around dysfunction with the abuse she suffered from her father, what this did was go out here and make it where she basically could not trust a man or be able to get close to a man. So this made it where she was having a hard time being able to connect or bond with a man because she didn't really grow up in an environment where she saw a model for manhood where she could be loved and nurtured, because the relationship a girl has with her father is the one that lays the foundation for her other relationships. And the great irony is that while Elizabeth Taylor oftentimes played the role of a daughter who was loved by men, like when she did in Father of the Bride with Spencer Tracy, she didn't get much love at home. And because she didn't get much love at home, what happened was most of her relationships were all business. And as her relationships became all business, she never could really get personal with any man. So she went out here and tried to have personal relationships with people, but most of the people she got involved with were ones that were looking to use her, and sadly, that were mostly using her to advance themselves as related to their business. And that was shown with many of her early relationships, which were all about trying to elevate other people. I mean, the first guy the studio arranged for her to date was a football champion named Glenn Davis, and they wanted to have her in a marriage for a business deal to elevate both. Then she was involved with a guy, William Pauley, who was a son of a U.S. ambassador. Then you had Howard Hughes, who was out here simping and wanted to buy Elizabeth Taylor. She wasn't seen as a person. She was seen as property. And at 18 years old, she was married to Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr., the heir to the Hilton Hotels chain. And This marriage was all about showing and spectacle. It was never really about her being loved for who she was. They had nothing in common with each other. And Conrad Hilton basically was looking to abuse Elizabeth Taylor because he saw her as property and not a person. And he's a textbook beta male that I will get into later on in this video. But their entire marriage wound up falling completely apart in less than a year. I mean, in less than a year, they wound up separating from each other. And that relationship basically fell apart. And Elizabeth Taylor, after the failure of her marriage to Conrad Hilton Jr., wound up getting involved with British actor Michael Wilding. And in this relationship, it basically showed her daddy issues because this man was at least 2 decades older than she was. And she really liked this man because it was the kind of relationship she wanted to have with her father. And as she got involved with this man, things in their life she wound up having children with this man. And as she started to grow more confident in herself, this is where the feminist paradigm came in, where she wanted to be the independent woman. And as this man was having his career fall just like her father, and as his career was falling apart and hers was rising in success, this man had the same resentment that her father had for her mother. So as this relationship basically started to mirror that of her mother and her father, then she wanted to break up with him. And that's when she got involved with Mike Todd. And after she got involved with Mike Todd was, again, he was basically like a Pookie in that he was looking to sensationalize their relationship. And as he looked to sensationalize their relationship, she had a daughter with him and was looking to create publicity stunts to get attention. So this is the type of stuff he would pull. Unfortunately, Mike Todd wound up dying in 1958 in a plane crash. And after he died in a plane crash, this is where we had Elizabeth Taylor, who was she was comforted by Mike Todd's friend Eddie Fisher, who she had an affair with. Now, Eddie Fisher was still married to Debbie Reynolds, and the affair created a scandal where Elizabeth Taylor was seen as a homewrecker because, like many feminist indoctrinated women, they don't know how to have relationships with men, and every time they have a relationship with a man, it's usually because it winds up turning into a power struggle. And usually these are the kind of women who, again, they get married on emotion. And Elizabeth Taylor got married to Eddie Fisher and got involved with Eddie Fisher because she was just really grieving her previous husband. And as she was grieving her previous husband, she basically proved a point that was made that a lot of these women, and what they do is if they will cheat with you, they will cheat on you. And she went out here, and after breaking up Eddie Fisher's marriage, then went out here and got involved with Richard Burton. And Richard Burton was married at the time. Now, as Elizabeth Taylor got involved with Richard Burton, she then had a relationship with him, and they starred in multiple films, even though they were part of this adulterous affair. And after they got married and divorced, they got married and divorced once more. And then Elizabeth Taylor finally got involved with a sixth husband, John Warner, who was a Republican politician from Virginia. She married him in 1976 and helped him on his electoral campaign. Unfortunately, what happened was she was overwhelmed because she actually had to submit to a man for the first time in a relationship. And because she had to submit to the authority of a man and follow the orders of a man, what happened was Elizabeth Taylor felt stifled in this relationship. She became lonely and depressed, being a politician's wife, became overweight, addicted to prescription drugs and alcohol. And all of this was because she, the feminist indoctrinated woman, could not deal with submitting to the authority of a man and following the lead of a man. And because she couldn't deal with submitting to the leadership of a man, this is why she went back on the paradigm of failure and went on here and got involved with different actors like Anthony Geary and George Hamilton, and eventually then married her last husband, Larry Fortensky, a guy who she met in rehab at the Betty Ford Center in 1988, basically getting involved with one last Pookie, or the final simp. And as she got involved with construction worker Larry Fortensky, she wound up getting involved with him. Unfortunately, that relationship wound up failing once more, and it wound up failing once more because of the issues of her hip operations and his obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, Elizabeth Taylor, again, she was a great and successful actress who had many great roles, many great signature roles as related to her film career, and she had, again, gone on to great acclaim as related to many of her roles ever since childhood. Unfortunately, she could never find the success that she wanted in a marriage because of the dysfunctional things that she learned as related to growing up in a almost feminist indoctrinated way by being a woman who had to learn how to do things for herself and work for herself. She never understood that in order for a marriage to work, the woman has to follow the man, and she never knew how to follow a man because she had always been taught to do things on her own. And that was the great tragedy of Elizabeth Taylor, was she never understood about the role of the woman being the helpmeet. Even though she was a deeply religious woman, she was winding up reading about religion but never learned about her role in God's order. And because she never knew about her role in God's order, what happened was she wound up on the road to becoming a woman in crisis, a woman in crisis who never had any sort of satisfaction as related to life. Yes, she had great fame and great accolades, but what happened with Elizabeth Taylor was she never got to really enjoy life as related to just living. Yes, she had great experiences and great things go on in her life, but she never got to enjoy them because even though she had great riches and great success, she never had that peace that a woman has when she's held and loved by a man. She never got to feel that kind of love because people used her from day one, and she never got to know the love of her father because her father resented her. So Elizabeth Taylor was a woman in crisis, and sadly she was on the paradigm of failure that many black women are on because they got indoctrinated into feminism. And because they got indoctrinated into feminism, they're thinking that they can go out here and they can go out here and they don't need a man. Elizabeth Taylor wanted a man, but the whole thing is she didn't know how to work with a man, and that's what made her wind up, even at 9 years old, sadly never learning how to work with a man. And because she never learned how to work with a man, sadly, this is why all of her marriages failed, and she wound up being alone and wound up on the road to becoming one of the greatest women in crisis in history. Now that I've gone in depth on why Elizabeth Taylor was a historical woman in crisis for this historical couples in crisis video, I'm going to be going in depth on detailing how Elizabeth Taylor's husbands were also men in crisis. And I'm going to be discussing 3 of those men in this video. And the first one I'm going to be talking about is Elizabeth Taylor's first husband, Conrad Hilton Jr. Now, Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr. is the eldest son of Conrad Hilton, the founder of the Hilton Hotels business that started in the 20th century. And Conrad Hilton Jr. basically started out on the road to becoming a man in crisis ever since the day he was born, because he was born to a father who divorced his mother, and as he was born to a father who divorced his mother, this basically started Conrad Hilton Jr. on the road to becoming a man in crisis. Now, kids who come from divorced households oftentimes wind up becoming men and women in crisis because they don't get their needs met by their parents. And that's what happened here with Conrad Hilton Jr., who saw his father go out here and divorce his mother to marry celebrity Zsa Zsa Gabor, because what happened with Conrad Hilton Jr. was that his father basically walked out on him and his mother in an effort to go out here and monkey branch to elevate his social status as a wealthy man by having a celebrity on his arm. And that's what Conrad Hilton Sr. did, that basically started Conrad Hilton Jr. on the road to becoming a man in crisis. Now, this model for manhood started Conrad Hilton Jr. on a road where he didn't learn to see women as people he needed to respect or regard. No, because he saw his father basically objectifying Zsa Zsa Gabor and abandoned his mother, this created an idea in his mind that women were basically objects that he could go out here and have his sexual pleasures with in the secret world. Now, with money, beta males, oftentimes because of the dysfunctional way they're raised, they have a hard time having relationships with women as related to the real world. And Conrad Hilton Jr. basically had a problem with having relationships with women due to the dysfunctional model he saw displayed for him by his father. Now, as he saw his father displaying this model, he was out here being the playboy and ladies' man on the surface. And as he was out here being this playboy and ladies' man, he really wasn't interested in any sort of business that his father had. Now, his father was grooming him to take over the family business, but he dropped out of college to join the Navy. And after he joined the Navy, his father enrolled him in another school, but he was suspended after 6 months. So he was basically drifting and going out here, basically looking to go out here and have sex with as many ladies as he wanted, and wanted to go out here and get with all sorts of high status women to be just like his father. So this beta male was basically chasing women, and as he was chasing women, his father was trying to make sure that his reputation wouldn't be one that would reflect badly on him. And this is basically what led to Conrad Hilton running into Elizabeth Taylor and looking to go out here and create a public image around Conrad Hilton, which would make the world smooth for Conrad Hilton Sr. They hoped that by having him marry Elizabeth Taylor, this would lead to them basically fixing Conrad Hilton Jr.'s reputation for womanizing and going out here and using and pumping and dumping women, because he was an original pump and dump guy. And as they were trying to do this, what happened was they tried to have them married in a very highly publicized ceremony, hoping this would lead to Conrad Hilton's image and reputation being fixed as related to him going out here womanizing, gambling, drinking, and even taking heroin. But things got progressively worse for Conrad Hilton Jr. because as he was married to Elizabeth Taylor, this was like mixing oil and water, because Elizabeth Taylor was a woman who was coming from dysfunction from her abusive relationship with her father. And the relationship with Conrad Hilton Jr. was basically like the relationship she had with her father, who was a man who was frustrated about being emasculated by his own daughter, by her making more money. But in the case of Conrad Hilton Jr., what really frustrated him was he had a boundary set on him as related to marriage. And this is what made him resent Elizabeth Taylor, because he felt like he was being stuck in this relationship with Elizabeth Taylor, and that was preventing him from being able to go out here and live his life in the secret world, as related to him womanizing and drinking and taking drugs. So this led to him having a lot of anger towards Elizabeth Taylor, because she was, one, getting a lot more attention than he was, and two, she was out here basically a ball and chain that was preventing him from having his fun. And this led to him having a lot of anger towards Elizabeth Taylor, because he never really loved Elizabeth Taylor. No, he was marrying her for business and marrying her to please his father. And as he was married in this marriage, trying to make his world smooth, he was simmering and boiling in anger about being in a relationship he didn't want to be in. And eventually he wound up exploding in a rage where he wound up abusing Elizabeth Taylor the same way her father wound up abusing her. And as he wound up abusing her in the same way that she was being beat up by her father, and things came to a violent climax when a pregnant Elizabeth Taylor was kicked in the stomach and forced to have a miscarriage. This is where Elizabeth Taylor decided to separate from Conrad Hilton Jr. after 8 months and wound up divorcing him in 1951. And after divorcing him in 1951, this basically led to the end of Elizabeth Taylor and Conrad Hilton Jr.'s marriage, a marriage that was destined to be a disaster because Conrad Hilton Jr. was one of these beta males who really wasn't interested in leading a woman in a marriage. No, he was one of these beta males who was basically drifting through life and living off his father's money, and became very angry when his smooth world wound up getting disrupted by his father's insistence that he marry Elizabeth Taylor, which basically I think upset him because his father was a bit of a hypocrite in saying that, oh, you need to marry, but the whole thing is he was out here with all these types of women and had Zsa Zsa Zagor because he felt guilty. He had her in a separate room. This is basically what led to Conrad Hilton being very angry and taking his anger out on Elizabeth Taylor. And as he took his anger out on Elizabeth Taylor, this basically took Elizabeth Taylor further down the road to becoming a woman in crisis, stranded in a paradigm of failure where her marriages didn't work. And this was basically laying the foundation for her other marriages not working because she got involved with a man very similar to her father. Now, this basically shows why it's important for a father to have a good relationship with his daughter, because a father's relationship with his daughter lays the foundation for all the other relationships a girl has with other men. And if that relationship that a girl has with her father isn't a healthy one, it leads to her being attracted to the same kind of man like her father. And that's basically what happened here with Elizabeth Taylor. With her first husband, she got involved with a man just like her father and was set up in a relationship just the same way her father and Louis B. Mayer were setting things up for her. And this basically took Elizabeth Taylor further down the road to becoming a woman in crisis. And as she married this man in crisis, it basically took her further down the road of dysfunction. And Conrad Hilton Jr. only got worse after he wound up divorcing Elizabeth Taylor. That's when his life went downhill. Now, in 1951, Betsy von Furstenberg wanted to engage Conrad Hilton, but they never got married, and possibly because she possibly found out how abusive he was and how addicted to alcohol he was. And he got arrested for drunk driving and got 2 years probation, and still went out here womanizing and using different women. Like he dated different actresses like Terry Moore, Mamie Van Doren, Arlene Sof, and Jean Carmen, and also dated Natalie Wood and Joan Collins at the same time. And he also dated a Mexican actress, Sylvia Pinal, at the opening of a hotel. And then eventually he married Patricia McClintock and wound up having 2 sons. And I believe that was also due to his father arranging that marriage. And after he married Patricia McClintock and married for business reasons, I believe, what happened with Conrad Hilton Jr. is that this marriage fell apart again because he didn't want to be the leader. He didn't want to be the head of household. He basically wanted to drift through life. He was basically like a Pookie. And as he was drifting through life, he became addicted to sleeping pills and alcohol. And sadly, what happened is he wound up divorcing his second wife. And after his second wife wound up divorcing him, what happened to Conrad Hilton Jr. was he basically wound up dying as a result of his addiction to alcohol. He wound up having a heart attack as a result of his addiction to alcohol. and wound up dying in February of 1969 at 42 years old. I mean, this man basically was a man in crisis, and was a man in crisis because he just was extremely dysfunctional, and he couldn't make anything work because he saw his father's model for dysfunction, which is quite ironic because his father ran the greatest hotel empire in 20th century history, but his son, with his name, couldn't run his business, take care of his own personal business, and wound up, because of his addictions to alcohol and drugs, winding up in a point where he and his wife, while she filed for a divorce, never really got to grant that divorce because while they were separated, Conrad Hilton was out here drinking and drugging and basically drugged himself to death, even though he had a lot of things as related to a legacy. He couldn't fulfill that legacy due to his addiction to drugs and alcohol. And sadly, Conrad Hilton went from being a man with a silver spoon in his mouth and on the road to success to winding up becoming yet another man in crisis in Elizabeth Taylor's life. Now, the second man I'm going to be talking about in this Couples in Crisis video is Eddie Fisher. Now, Eddie Fisher was a very popular 20th century singer who had sold millions of records and was even hosting his own TV show, The Eddie Fisher Show. And Eddie Fisher was very good friends with Mike Todd, a producer in Hollywood who was Elizabeth Taylor's third husband, and oftentimes Mike Todd and Elizabeth Taylor would hang out with Eddie Fisher and Eddie Fisher's first wife, Debbie Reynolds. Now, they were very good friends and hung out together for years until Mike Todd decided to go and take his personal plane to a trip to receive an award, and sadly Mike Todd's plane wound up crashing in New Mexico, and Mike Todd and 3 other individuals wound up losing their lives. And after they wound up losing their lives, Elizabeth Taylor became extremely distraught about the passing of her husband. And as Elizabeth Taylor became extremely distraught regarding the passing of her husband, what happened with Elizabeth Taylor was she was looking for a man's shoulder to lean on, and the man's shoulder she was looking to lean on was the Eddie Fisher. Now, Elizabeth Taylor was out here looking to lean on the shoulder of Eddie Fisher, and Eddie Fisher was basically looking to use this as, I believe, an opportunity to elevate his social status, because Elizabeth Taylor was an A-list star at the time, and what he wanted to do was go out here and, I believe, monkey branch like many beta males like to do when they have a high social status. They want to monkey branch to a woman who has a higher social status, because Debbie Reynolds, yes, she was an actress, but Elizabeth Taylor was a star, and him getting involved with Elizabeth Taylor, I believe what he wanted to do was go out here and elevate his social status by monkey branching to a higher status woman, and that's something that beta males love to do as part of their male hypergamy. And that's what Eddie Fisher wound up doing by getting involved with Elizabeth Taylor. And as he got involved with Elizabeth Taylor, what happened was this caused a lot of scandal in Hollywood at the time. And as this caused a lot of scandal at the time, it wound up making a lot of press, and what that press was unfavorable. And eventually what happened to Eddie Fisher was he wound up losing his contract with NBC for the Eddie Fisher Show, because back then in the 1950s, if you had an affair like this, it was seen very negatively. And with Eddie Fisher being a very young man, it was not seen as impressionable or favorable for young children to see a man participating in an extramarital affair with a widow at the time. It was very, very negative as related to the press. And this infamous whole affair basically led to Eddie Fisher winding up divorcing his wife Debbie Reynolds and going into full simp mode as he went out here and looked to monkey branch over to Elizabeth Taylor, making the biggest mistake any guy could do in getting involved with a single mother. Now, as Eddie Fisher wound up getting involved with single mother Elizabeth Taylor, his life got more dysfunctional, and it got more dysfunctional because he basically abandoned his wife and turned her into a single mom to get involved with a single mom. But this is what beta males go out here and do. And what happened to Eddie Fisher as he was in this relationship with Elizabeth Taylor? It didn't really work well for him because he wound up having fights with Elizabeth Taylor, who had already been married 3 times. And the reason why he was having problems with Elizabeth Taylor wasn't the fact that she was grieving her late husband, Mike Todd. It had been the fact that Elizabeth Taylor had been married 2 times before, and she had the spirits and DNA of 2 other men inside of her. And because she had the spirits and DNA of 2 other men inside of her, that marriage between Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher was destined to not work. And it was destined not to work because Elizabeth Taylor already had spiritual bonds to 2 previous other men, which included Conrad Hilton Jr. and another guy who was an actor. And the spirits of those men were basically fighting inside of Elizabeth Taylor. Yes, those men basically went on with their lives, but Elizabeth Taylor still had a part of the spirits and DNA of those men inside of her. And this is what led to her not being able to submit to the authority of Eddie Fisher, in addition to the abuse she endured at her father, going out here and beating her for making more money than he did. And all of this created a power struggle as related to the relationship between Eddie Fisher and Elizabeth Taylor. And that power struggle basically made it where Elizabeth Taylor was having a hard time with him, and things escalated as related to several situations. There was one incident where Eddie Fisher allegedly pulled a gun and put it to Elizabeth Taylor's head, and they continued to have lots of fights. And they were having fights because Elizabeth Taylor had a conflict inside of herself as related to her spirit. And this was even though you had Elizabeth Taylor looking to try to help Eddie Fisher as related to his career. She got him a job in a movie called Butterfield 8, where he played the beta male, ironically, and played the beta male who was watching Elizabeth Taylor going out here and dating other guys and being a side piece. So Elizabeth Taylor hated the movie Butterfield 8, but the movie Butterfield 8 basically was telling a lot of truth regarding Elizabeth Taylor, and I think that's the main reason why she hated the movie Butterfield 8. But the movie Butterfield 8 was one where Eddie Fisher got a job working with his wife at the time, but that relationship that he had with Elizabeth Taylor was a tumultuous one. And it was a tumultuous one because Elizabeth Taylor had no spiritual bond to Eddie Fisher the way he had with his wife, Debbie Reynolds. And what was sad was this basically put Eddie Fisher on a road to a paradigm of marriage failure, because once he wound up leaving his first wife, who he had a spiritual bond to, he then wound up getting involved with multiple other women. And as he got involved with 5 other women, he had almost as many marriages as Elizabeth Taylor. He had 5 marriages and wound up on the road to becoming a man in crisis who was incapable of being able to maintain a healthy relationship. And he wasn't able to maintain a healthy relationship because he was out here looking to monkey branch from one popular woman to another popular woman as related to elevating his social status, but he couldn't go out here and elevate his social status any further, because even when he was out here married to Debbie Reynolds, he was out here having an affair with model Pat Sheehan. But eventually, Eddie Fisher refused to divorce his wife, Debbie Reynolds. But the whole thing is he wound up divorcing her later on to marry Elizabeth Taylor. So he basically was in some ways a whoremonger male, just basically using and taking advantage of women. But the whole thing was he had a squeaky clean image, and that squeaky clean image was tarnished when he got involved with Elizabeth Taylor. And as his squeaky clean image wound up getting tarnished, his career went into a major decline. And he went into a decline because this beta male basically was doing some dirty macking. And as he did some dirty macking and had Elizabeth Taylor as a side piece, he went from being a married man to becoming a man in crisis. And even as he was out here with Elizabeth Taylor, what happened was Elizabeth Taylor was not spiritually bonded to Eddie Fisher the way she was with her first husband, and even that was a bit of a mess. And as Elizabeth Taylor got involved in this dysfunctional relationship, she was not feeling emotionally satisfied or emotionally secure due to the abuse she suffered from her previous husband and as Conrad Hilton Jr. and the abuse she suffered at the hands of her father. And because she never felt emotionally secure and was basically using Eddie Fisher as a rebound guy. I mean, Eddie Fisher was basically the Dennis Rodman of the relationships. He was grabbing the rebound from the death of Mike Todd. But after Elizabeth Taylor emotionally somewhat recovered, this is where she hoped to participate in some hypergamy by monkey branching to a man who she thought would possibly meet her emotional needs in a better fashion. And that's where she decided to start having an affair with actor Richard Burton. And that's when Eddie Fisher went from being the man in her life to being a man on the road to a paradigm of failure where he was going to become a man in crisis. Now, the third and final man I'm going to be talking about in this Couples in Crisis video is Elizabeth Taylor's fifth husband, Richard Burton. Now, Richard Burton was Elizabeth Taylor's fifth husband after she had an affair on her then fourth husband, Eddie Fisher. And as she had this affair with Richard Burton to be able to get her emotional needs met from the stifling, what she called, relationship with Eddie Fisher, she then started to believe that she wanted to have a closer relationship with Richard Burton. And as she was looking to go out here and monkey branch away from Eddie Fisher over to Richard Burton, this is where Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton became yet another infamous couple in the tabloids. Now, Richard Burton, before this, was actually born Richard Walter Jenkins Jr., and he was the 12th of 13 children in the family of Richard Walter Jenkins Sr. and Edith Maud Jenkins. Now, Richard Burton basically was on the road to becoming a man in crisis when his mother passed away when he was 2 years old, and he wound up living with his aunt, who basically gave him some structure. But because his father was an alcoholic, he had no model for manhood in his early years, and basically was living with his aunt and his uncle, who were both minors, and they were looking to care for him, but they couldn't do but so much. And luckily for Richard Burton, he did run into a father figure in Philip Burton, the man whose last name he took. And Philip Burton, who wanted to be an actor himself, wasn't able to do this, but was able to start mentoring Richard Jenkins. And out of all the gratitude he had for Philip Burton, Richard Jenkins then changed his last name to Richard Burton. And as Richard Burton went on, he became a part of the military in the Royal Air Force and started also doing theater at the time as he was in the Royal Air Force. And as he was doing theater in the Royal Air Force, he then eventually started going on to start working towards his career in Hollywood, which started in the 1950s. And as he was working towards building his career, eventually he wound up running into Elizabeth Taylor, who was out here coming off the relationship with Eddie Fisher, which basically Eddie Fisher was like Dennis Rodman grabbing the rebound after Elizabeth Taylor's husband, Mike Todd, wound up passing away. And as Eddie Fisher wound up grabbing that rebound, he thought he was going to be able to have a relationship with the most beautiful woman in the world, Elizabeth Taylor, and he thought he would be able to have a relationship with a woman who he could possibly use as an attachment to elevate his career. However, Elizabeth Taylor wasn't in a place where she could go out here and emotionally bond with Eddie Fisher at all. And I don't even think Eddie Fisher wanted to bond with Elizabeth Taylor. He just wanted to use her to elevate his career and wanted to make himself a star. Unfortunately, it didn't really work out that well for him, because in America, getting involved with a woman in an affair was seen negatively, and this basically impacted his career in a negative fashion, and put Eddie Fisher on a paradigm of failure. And after Eddie Fisher wound up on the paradigm of failure, Elizabeth Taylor, still looking to get her emotional needs met through love, started to look at Richard Burton, who was a married man himself, who had 2 children. And as Richard Burton was out here, Elizabeth Taylor wanted to make a move on Richard Burton, thinking that he could possibly be the love of her life. And as she thought he could be the love of her life, she started to monkey branch over to Richard Burton and thought things would be better with Richard Burton. Unfortunately, she went from one man in crisis to another man in crisis. And while Liz and Dick made a lot of headlines in tabloids and made a lot of press in entertainment circles, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton's relationship became just as dysfunctional as the one she had with her father. And sadly, I would have to say that it basically mirrored that of the dysfunctional father-daughter relationship, because Elizabeth Taylor's father was an alcoholic, just like Richard Burton was an alcoholic, just like his father. And as Elizabeth Taylor got involved with this alcoholic, she basically wound up in a situation where she wound up with yet another man like her father. And this was the fourth man who was just like her father, proving a point that I made in my book, The Woman Crisis, that oftentimes what happens to a lot of feminist indoctrinated women is that their daddy issues oftentimes undermine their relationships. And they undermine their relationships because as these women try to have relationships with men, the model for manhood they have is dysfunctional. And because the model for manhood they have is dysfunctional, they wind up in a vicious cycle, in a paradigm of failure, where they keep having the same relationship with different men, not understanding it's the model for relationships that they learn that basically puts them on a road where every relationship that they have winds up failing. And that's what happened here with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. What happened was every time she would get involved with a guy like Richard Burton, again, she was looking for a man who was similar to her father, and that quest to find that man like her father always put her in the road of dysfunctional men in crisis, and those men could not ever meet her emotional needs because she basically learned about emotional insecurity from the first relationship she had with a man, which was her father. So this is what put her on a bad road with Richard Burton, and that road led to her having arguments and fights and even possible physical abuse as related to the relationship between Liz and Dick. And sadly, the relationship between Liz and Dick was one of the most dysfunctional relationships that they had. I mean, what happened with Elizabeth Taylor was she married Richard Burton twice, because the first time she married him, it didn't work out as related to her career, and it didn't work out the second time, because what happened the second time was after she married the senator and he made all these formal rules, she couldn't handle that relationship because she didn't want to submit to his authority. Moreover, all the spirits and DNA of all of these other men inside of her really prevented her from being able to get close to Richard Burton as she wanted, because she had all these other spirits tearing at her soul. And as they tore at her soul, Richard Burton became more dysfunctional, starting to drink even more. And he drank even more after this, and eventually wound up becoming even more of an alcoholic, and eventually started to have further issues as related to the failed marriages, and then started having issues as related to some guilt he had because his brother wound up, as he was drinking, he wound up falling down and breaking his neck, and wound up paralyzed. So he felt very guilty about that, because with Richard Burton, he was again having serious problems with drinking, because it had been modeled for him as related to his family, and was just he was at one time drinking 3 to 4 bottles of hard liquor a day, and he was a hardcore alcoholic, and he was a man in crisis and having a problem with alcoholism because of the dysfunctional state of the family he came from. So Richard Burton was in a rough place, and he was drinking 3 to 4 bottles a day, and smoking cigarettes 3 to 5 packs a day. So this basically exacerbated a lot of health problems for Richard Burton, who was dealing with issues as related to his numerous relationships that fell apart, because he got married multiple times after he divorced Elizabeth Taylor, and that further exacerbated all of his problems, because while he had great success with his career, he was struggling in his personal life, and he struggling with his personal life because he was dealing with a lot of issues as related to his life. So Richard Burton was really dealing with a lot as related to things in his life. He was a man in crisis attracted to a woman in crisis in Elizabeth Taylor, and this couple in crisis was one of the most infamous ones of the 20th century. And while they were infamous for their fame, what happened with Richard Burton was he wasn't able to enjoy a full and abundant life like Christ wants to give us. No, he wasn't able to enjoy that in spite of all of the success. I mean, he was very miserable towards the later part of his life, and those health problems basically came so bad that Richard Burton wound up passing away even before Elizabeth Taylor or Eddie Fisher. I mean, Eddie Fisher died in 2010. Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011, but Richard Burton sadly wound up passing away in 1984 at 58 years old, as related to the serious health problems he had for years of drinking alcohol. I mean, his liver had been enlarged, he had cirrhosis and kidney disease by 1981. I mean, he was dealing with a lot of issues as related to his health, and he was basically struggling with things. And Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor originally planned to be buried together, but what happened was his widow went out here and bought the plot next to Richard Burton's and erected headstones across both to prevent Elizabeth Taylor from being buried there. She wasn't going to be buried there anyway because they were separate from each other. So Richard Burton went on from being a married man with a promising career to being a man in crisis, and was part of a couple in crisis that was a major part of 20th century entertainment history. Now, if you want to learn more about what leads to men like Richard Burton winding up on the road to becoming dysfunctional, you can pick up my book, The Man Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Man Crisis at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble. And if you want to learn why women like Elizabeth Taylor wind up on the road to dysfunction that leads to them becoming women in crisis, you can pick up my book, The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Woman Crisis at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble. And if you want to learn why women like Elizabeth Taylor wind up on the road to becoming single, in their later years and for the rest of their lives. You can pick up my book, Why 70% of Black Women Are Single, on Amazon.com. Yes, it's about black women, but it has a lot of information that pertains to women of all races, and that book will help you learn why so many women are single, because they wind up in a paradigm of failure. And you can get that book on Amazon in paperback and Kindle format. You can also get it at other online booksellers in digital format, and like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And you can also go out here and find that book at other online paperback booksellers like Target, Walmart, and Barnes & Noble. And if you want to see me make more videos in the Hollywood historical men and women in crisis, or the Hollywood couples in crisis series, you can send a donation of a minimum of $15 to the PayPal or the Cash App. And if I do research on these individuals or celebrities, I will make that video for you. That's all I have to say for this installment of the Hollywood Historical Couples in Crisis series. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, All About the Goddess. The Goddess Next Door bears all in the art studio to catch a campus stalker in this action-packed Isis series mystery. Get your copy of Isis, All About the Goddess in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Now available in paperback and e-readers. From the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Man Crisis, comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback and e-readers everywhere at online booksellers today.